Um, I should really give the word to Fulya, who's going to conduct the conversation. We deliberately decided that we wouldn't talk to. I've never met her before, and we deliberately decided we would never talk to each other before the meeting. That it would be better if we sort of quarreled on the spot. It's going to be a spontaneous discussion. But Fulya is a great authority on detective fiction, which I am not. So I better leave it to you to start.
Okay, Andy. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Always great pleasure to be surrounded by fellow Sherlockians. I'm Fulya, and I'll be moderating the talk today. So, Andy, shall we start? Do you want to read a passage, or
why don't you ask a question and we'll work to a passage, I think?
So, yes, I'm really actually wondering about how this idea came to you in the first place. Many elements to it.
Yeah. Just bad luck, I guess, is the answer.
I presume.
It happened. I was reading a book by Philip Mansell called Constantinople, City of the Heart's Desire. Is that right? World. Anyway, City of the World's Desire, and there was a passage in parentheses, which was basically he was describing the paradox of Abdülhamid, how Abdülhamid II, the last great Ottoman Sultan, was a modernizer but a traditionalist, very canny but very foolish, and there were all these different things about how he read the Quran, but he would also have Sherlock Holmes read to him by his foster brother, the son of his milk nurse, before he went to sleep at night. And it just seems such a striking image that, the shadow of God on earth, this man who ruled over empires in Mecca would, hide under the bed covers and like Shahrazad's husband would have stories read to him every night. And so that was the germ of the idea. Of course, it was slow developing, but that was really where I started.
Yeah. And Abdülhamid had a whole translation bureau, right, for detective fiction.
Well, as I was to learn, he went about this very seriously. I mean, I've taken some liberties in the book. It's in my version. The first story that he reads is the Adventure of the Speckled Band, which is published much in 1891, I think. Mm-hmm. Whereas, in fact, the first adventure that he really read was in 1903, which was called The Empty House, which is after Sherlock Holmes comes back from the dead. But he had a whole translation bureau which would churn out detective fiction for him, and indeed. What is it? The great archaeologist Halit Cembel, who was the first Turkish, probably the first Muslim woman to compete in the Olympics in 1936 as a fencing champion. I think I don't know how old she was then, but she was the one who Hitler refused to shake Jesse Owens' hand. She refused to shake Hitler's hand, but her father was a high-level bureaucrat who translated detective fiction for Abdülhamid. So it's that's really quite a seminal thing. I mean, the other germ of the idea, which was possibly less, it could have happened. I didn't think much sure that it did happen. Is that Arthur Conan Coyle on his deathbed was asked which of the Sherlock Holmes adventures he liked the best, and he says, "Well, I hated them all because no one remembers me for my serious work," and he did resent the fame of Sherlock Holmes. I mean, you can imagine it was like people would write these, thousands of letters a day saying, "I lost my keys, where can you find them?" Or "My wife ran off," and he was like Santa Claus. He was getting sort of letters from people. So he did really resent Sherlock Holmes. But he says, but he was. His famous last words, which, no one could make sense of, was that there is one adventure which continues to intrigue me, which is the adventure of the second wife. But of course, there is no adventure of the second wife. And so there is this, I wouldn't call, is fanatical the right word? But anyway, there's an obsessive Sherlock Holmes community, which which spends hours and hours and hours deciding, going through 1884 editions of, train guides to see if there was a train that would have gotten Watson to, Esher in time to do this and that and the other thing. And so for them, this, of course, is the great mystery of what did Conan Doyle mean when he said the adventure of the second wife. And there's a whole litany of what do they call the stories that he made. There's a whole bunch of Sherlock Holmes stories which don't exist, which Watson refers to in the text. And there's the giant rat of Sumatra, which is the most famous example, or the great poisoner and whatever. There's all these cases which are unregistered and unrecorded. So this, of course, is the great unrecorded case, and it falls to our unlikely hero and his companion, a Turkish professor, to resolve this mystery. But of course, in so doing, they completely upend their lives. You pay a price for being too curious, I guess.
Now, who's Sherlock and who is Watson here?
Well,
Andy, between your characters.
Well, it's quite obvious that the Turkish professor is the Sherlock Holmes figure. I mean, my Watson, who's literally called Watson for reasons too complicated to explain, thinks that he's the one who's solving the mystery, but of course, he gets the help of this woman, this companion, and she sort of basically takes the mystery away from him, and a lot of other things besides. But she clearly. I mean, the first encounter that they have, which is in Paddington Station, is it's pretty clear who's wearing the. Not the trousers, but smoking the pipe.
Yes. That's correct. So there's a very rich historical context here in the novel, Andy, and you're a journalist, I know. What kind of research did you do? There are two very iconic characters, Sherlock Holmes and Abdülhamid, and we have two fictional characters, Leyla Aslan and John Watson. Mm-hmm. And they both have their own personal histories, and that also affects the narrative. And it's beautifully woven together. Please tell us about your research progress.
Well, the research, I mean, the first thing I discovered was this fanatical community. Was when I was researching online, I suddenly discovered that I wasn't the only person interested in Sherlock Holmes. That there was a whole what they call scions all over the world who are devoted to Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, there was. The codicil to this story was that although Philip Mansell was how I first discovered this thing, and years later we went to it was Caroline's birthday. I was at a fellowship in America. We went to Chicago where Philip was giving a talk, and I was a bit late, and I'm in this room in the Newberry Library in Chicago, this vast place, and there wasn't a seat to be had in this whole vast library, this whole building, and I thought, my God, all these people are coming out on a Saturday afternoon in Chicago to hear a lecture about the Habsburgs' relations with the Ottomans. I was really impressed, and it turned out, of course, that Philip's lecture was upstairs in this tiny little room, but where I was in the middle of a Sherlock Holmes exhibition, and the lecture was being given by this famous Sherlockian who was later discovered garroted in his bedroom, in a sealed bedroom. So I missed a lecture to go to Philip, and I could never catch up because the person who gave it was, what's he called, Lance, God, famous name, but I forget it, was no longer there. But in terms of research, to answer the question, I mean, there was reading the stories, but there was also discovering about the time in which it took place. And a key element in the plot is the fact that in 1893, Conan Doyle is fed up with Sherlock Holmes and can't stand him anymore, and has him fall over the Rickenbach Fall to his death. And in a story called The Final Adventure, and The Final Problems. And for some reason I thought I would read this in the original, in a copy of the Strand magazine, which is where all the which was where all the Sherlock Holmes stories were first published. So I went down to what was then sort of Conan Doyle HQ, which was the Sherlock Holmes collection in Marylebone Public Library, which no longer exists. But in the basement of that library was everything anyone could imagine to do with Conan Doyle or Sherlock Holmes. So I got that sort of unbound version of the Strand magazine and, read about the death of Sherlock Holmes. And on the sort of left-hand side of the page, the verso was, the famous picture of Watson peering over the cliff edge and no longer, his friend is gone. And on the very next page was another article, and it had a picture of Abdülhamid. And a full page, the only photograph ever taken of Abdülhamid, which was taken in 1867, I think. He was on the Ottoman family for the first time and only time went to Europe to see the Paris exhibition, and Abdülhamid was just a prince then, no possibility of him ever ascending the throne, and he came to London and had his pictures taken on Ebury Street. And that photo was on the next page, and the article was by this Muslim Indian from Pune, who was a barrister at the Inns of Court called Rafiuddin Ahmed, and he wrote this, what was really a panegyric to Abdülhamid and to Turkey, and basically saying how foolish England was for, not supporting the Ottoman Empire, because this was the bulwark against Russia, and if Russia were given its way, they would invade the Indian subcontinent, and of course that would have been a disaster for the Muslim community, which he cared about in India. So this character Rafiuddin Ahmed, who became an intimate of Queen Victoria and actually went to the palace and would teach Queen Victoria what he called Hindustani, which I guess is Urdu. And Queen Victoria could actually write Arabic letters and would write, couplets from the poet Sadi in the original Persian, which he taught her. Suddenly I thought I was making this up, and of course, suddenly, it seemed like there was this real story. So Rafiuddin Ahmed became a sort of character in the book as well, although I think he was far more interesting than I could have possibly ever depicted.
That's a great discovery, though.
It was.
That's a big sign from the universe.
Yeah, exactly.
That this book needed to be written.
It was God fooling me and said, you have to spend the next years of your life finishing this book.
Did you know about Abdülhamid's fascination with Holmes by then, or?
Well, I did. Yeah, well, of course, I knew that was where I started.
Yeah.
And of course, it turns out that this fascination with Holmes was much deeper and greater than I could possibly imagine. That I can't remember his name now. The one who wrote The Lives of the Bengal Lancers writes about a book about the deposition of Abdülhamid in 1909. And while Abdülhamid is waiting to be overthrown and waiting for the Young Turks to sort of come in and turf him out of the palace, in order to pass the time, he's reading a Sherlock Holmes story. And then again in 1912, when in the Balkan Wars, when the Balkan armies are approaching and about to invade, are recapturing bits of Thrace that have been in Ottoman hands for centuries. And Abdülhamid by this time is in exile in Thessaloniki, in that famous mansion. They're basically he's being manhandled out of the palace, and he's obviously resisting this and being taken on the Lorelei, a German gunboat, back to Istanbul, to Beylerbeyi, where he eventually dies. And the first thing he asks the people who they think he's, because he's being, they think he's got dementia, but of course he doesn't. Because the first thing he asks the people who are shipping him back to Istanbul is the world still fascinated by Sherlock Holmes? And he sort of comments about how Sherlock Holmes would have made a great chief of police if he could have headed Abdülhamid's, one of the secret police.
First thing I would ask too.
Yeah, exactly.
I would never thought that I would have something in common with Abdülhamid II, but we do.
Yeah.
So, can you elaborate more on his role in the book and how his fascination with Holmes drives narrative, actually?
Well, originally he was going to be the main character, but of course, he's a very difficult man to depict because he was hated by the subsequent generations of young Turks and early Republicans. His reputation has been resurrected now as the great nationalist and the person who defended the Ottoman Empire from the Western world. So his reputation has been distorted by so many people, and we don't really know that much about him. I mean, there is only he only posed for one photograph before he even became a sultan. I mean, there are other pictures of him, driving his carriage to Friday prayers, but we don't really know that much about his life. And the great insight was Ethem Eldon, the great an Ottoman historian of the 19th century, said, well, the thing about him was that he was just very bourgeois, and that was the sort of I latched onto that this was that this was an ordinary man who was and the thing about him in my book is that he liked Sherlock Holmes. So he's you see Abdülhamid as through different eyes. So he is a character in the book, but it's told by different people in different aspects. So he's a shadowy figure in the book, as he was, I think, in real life. But there is a passage in the book which
Yes.
I'm going to read to you, which sort of describes all this, this is a part of a first-person narrative. Much of the book is a first-person narrative, but not all of it. And of course, it's my Watson, my 20th century Watson, who's telling this story, who's also quite a shadowy figure. But that's another question, another story. Anyway, so. So I also attended a Catholic prep school, where one of the things I learned, apart from pidgin Latin, is that we are all so much worse and so much better than we pretend. Abdülhamid was a cunning reformer who used tradition to sweeten the pill of modernity, and then piety to cover his tracks. His empire simmered with revolt, and he tried to fight plague with pestilence, and to douse the flames of rebel nationalism with nationalist fires of his own. To foreign emissaries, he complained that his hands were tied by the backwardness of his people, but to the local imam he blamed the British. He was a man of ambiguity, a loving father who ruled through fear, but was himself too afraid to venture out from behind the palace walls. And he had one clear redeeming feature. He was addicted to Sherlock Holmes. The monarch's own foster brother, that is, the son of his milk nurse, was the unlikely Scheherazade, who read the translated stories to him from behind a screen in his bedroom as he went to sleep. So eagerly did he await the appearance of a fresh adventure that a special courier was on hand to catch the Dover train the moment the latest copy of The Strand left the press. One copy was put in the diplomatic pouch to sail through Gibraltar, another on the train shipped to Marseille, and still a third through Vienna on the Orient Express. This may or may not be true. I have visited the Mabeyne, the Sultan's office in Yildiz Palace in Istanbul, where the translators tore it away, including, as I was discovering. I would say that to understand the story, you also have to understand Istanbul. But I am not convinced that such a thing is possible. I do not pretend the city is Eastern and inscrutable. In many ways, it is friendly and familiar. But it is devious, like somebody I could mention. But it is devious, like the pub raconteur, who, while you work out if he is spinning a tale, as you buy him another round. In each visit, I felt I had come to a different place. It was like watching a time-lapse kaleidoscope of urban scroll. Istanbul is a city where things change with a whir, and where standing still feels like falling through air. Of course, I change too, but that is not something I will ever sit down to write. As a Watson, it is my fate. We tell stories, but try as we might, they are never about ourselves.
Yes.
Of course it is. But there you go.
That sounds good.
London is very important for the Holmes canon, of course. And here we both have London and Istanbul. I've always found it very hard to write about settings and cities, incorporating them into the narrative. Did you face any challenges? You've been in Istanbul for so long, of course.
Well, I guess, it's a good question. I mean, the principle, I think, the reason I latched onto this, I think, this idea of Abdülhamid'in and Sherlock Holmes, one of the reasons it was attractive to me was that these were my two adopted cultures. I'm not British and I'm not Turkish, but these were the two places where I spent most of my life. And so there's a musical accompaniment to this. That's right. I'll stop. Maybe.
Istanbul, right?
And but the thing is that because I was from neither of these places, I sort of hesitate to write about them because they are still, however many years I spent here, they're still slightly alien to me, both places. So by going back into the past, I could come up, I could create a world which which I knew as well as anyone else. And I think that was the principle behind it. And of course, my narrator is, he's sort of discovering a London that I knew when I first went to London in the 1960s and 70s, and of course, the Istanbul that I describe is the 1990s, which was another world as well. So there's the distant past in the 1890s, but also there's the not the recent past, which which I guess very few people know or remember. So basically, I was able to create my own world, I think, by this sneaky device.
Yes, and how did you develop the characters, Andrew? First of all, we have a strong female lead here, and this is a new addition to Holmes canon. Of course, we have many examples of it. First of all, did you face any challenges there? And secondly, how the dynamic between your characters compares to the classic Holmes and Watson partnership?
Well, the way I develop the characters is, if I'm giving you a truthful answer, it's slightly embarrassing. Is that I was fascinated by this notion of Conan Doyle, and the second wife and this story that no one knows, and I was fascinated by Abdülhamid's fascination with Sherlock Holmes, and I wrote this sort of great treatise on this, which I sent off to an agent, and he said, "Oh, this is terrible because novels are about character." And so then I sort of sat down and I thought, well, yes, he's right, and so suddenly the people who were trying to solve this problem became quite important in their own right, and after that, I think everyone, I would sort of milk every bit of the book for just to try and push the characters along and discover things about the characters. And of course, there's many mysteries in this book, and that the adventure of the second wife is just one of them.
Yeah.
These characters all have pasts and secrets, and I sort of began to discover that as well. And I had the book sort of plotted out, and then at a certain point, what happened to me, I think, happens to a lot of authors, which is that suddenly your characters tell you to get lost, and this is my story, not your story, and this is where we're going, and you can come along if you want, but I'm not going where you're telling me to, and that happened in a big major way, and suddenly the book, I was on a cliff edge myself. I was suddenly in a place I had never planned to be, and the redeeming thing of this is that eventually I finished the book, and eventually, thanks to the publishers who employed a very thorough proofreader who turned out totally by coincidence to be a Sherlock Holmes addict herself, and knew things about Sherlock Holmes that I could never know. Sorry, what was the point of all this?
The characters.
The characters. Anyway, we'll leave it there.
Yeah. Okay. So you have many highly acclaimed nonfiction books, and now we have a fiction, and it's crime fiction. Why this choice in the first place? How did you decide to write fiction and crime fiction? Discussion.
Well, I mean, the point is, I obviously I had a journalistic career, and I wrote, books about academic books and also popular books about Turkey. So the thing is, I could write, if I wanted to explain the politics, if I wanted to explain, what was happening in Turkey and why this happened and why that happened, I had lots of places I could do this. So I wasn't going to do this in this novel. I mean, there was no point writing a novel in which I was going to explain the history of Turkey. There was, if I wanted to explain or try and explain the history of Turkey, I would, I could do it somewhere else. So, I suppose I like many people, I latched onto the idea of a whodunit, of a crime, of a crime that needed to be solved as a sort of, as an easy deus ex machina, as an engine which would drive a book forward. But of course, as the book went forward, of course, it went off in another direction. That's how I was going to finish the story. The famous proofreader, said that she wasn't really into the book until she got to that chapter, which is the chapter where the book takes off in a totally different direction, and she thought that chapter was really excellent and brilliant, and so that was a sort of redemption of this fact that you just follow where the characters and the ideas lead you. And I suppose and what I wanted to do was, I wanted to write a mystery story, but not one that would end when the mystery was revealed. In other words, the idea was to write a story where, there were layers, and also when, I don't know if you've ever. There's the famous, William Goldman Adventures in the Skin, what's called Adventures in the Skin Trade or something, a book about script writing, and he says the great thing you have to do is when the plot's revealed, you end the film. There's no point going on and on and on. You have to end there, and of course then there's the Lord of the Rings, approach, which is you have an ending, then another ending, then another ending, then another ending, and so the idea is that there's an incident in the book which is told 3 times, which by 3 different narrators and 3 different perspectives on the same event. And that's where I end. But the whole idea is that the ending should be more satisfying than just, this is the person, this is what the crime was, this is who did it. That there should be a sort of more dramatic and fulfilling ending. And when I was teaching in Boğaziçi all those years ago, I was teaching E.M. Forster's aspects in the novel, and which I suppose I'm sure people poo-poo that book now, but there's a chapter on plot and a chapter on story, and the story is what happens, A, B, C, D, and the plot is something where I guess half the time the author doesn't know what the plot is or what the book is really about, and so the idea was to get to the end and then try and provide a satisfying ending that was somehow got to grips with what the book is about. Although if you ask me what it's about, I'm sure I don't know, but there you are. There you are.
So Andy, how do you evaluate the lasting impact of Sherlock Holmes? So many interpretations, so many retellings, so many pastiches. You are telling a story here, but you've also written a pastiche in this story. You have a Sherlock Holmes pastiche. How do you evaluate his lasting impact?
Again, it's maybe an irreverent answer, but when I was a kid in America, we would watch things called situation comedies, and the thing about a situation comedy is you had characters and you put them in different situations, but the plot was always the same, and it was always the same characters, and you grew familiar with those characters, and the actual story somehow didn't really matter that much. And the thing about the Sherlock Holmes story is that you have two brilliant characters, and there's a relationship between them. And there's the savant Sherlock Holmes who knows what you had for dinner 3 years ago, and then there's Watson who doesn't know which end is up, and there's the interaction between the two of them, and that became a sort of formula for so much detective fiction, including, I guess, my own.
Yeah.
That it's. I mean, so many of the stories are really quite mediocre, I guess. I mean, there are the great stories, the early stories, or not maybe the way in which. But the thing that everyone likes about Sherlock Holmes is when Sherlock Holmes goes off piste and he says, "Oh well, I can tell that you had ham and eggs for breakfast on Thursday." And how could you possibly know that? And when you reveal that, so he does these parlor tricks, and of course, it's the parlor tricks which everyone loves, as opposed to the fact that who did it, as it were, who did it is that's not really so important.
Yeah. Providing a logical explanation to everything chaotic. I guess the 19th century Londoners mostly loved Holmes because of that. Final problem. The story where Conan Doyle killed off Holmes is very important in the canon, and also very important for the adventure of the second one.
Yeah.
How do you evaluate Doyle's approach to his own creation? The way he didn't like it, the way he wanted to be known for his more serious works, and how do you think that impacted the fate of crime fiction up until now?
Well, I guess the fact that he had to bring him back to life. I mean, the explanation is that his accountant said, you'd better bring Sherlock Holmes back, or we're not going to be able to pay the wine bills.
Yeah.
And that's what happens. And he kills Sherlock Holmes in 1893, and the December issue of the Strand, and then I can't remember when The Hound of the Baskervilles is published,
1897.
97. He creates this novella which takes place before the death of Sherlock Holmes, and then by 1903 he says enough is enough. I'll have to bring him back. And there you are. But when he brings him back, there's never
the same.
It's never the same sort of excitement or life, and some of those stories are really quite dull, I think.
Never the same. But the outlash he faced, he got letters telling him he was a monster. I don't think that any 19th century readers would go up to Dickens and say, "You monster, Dickens." I think that was the first time in literature that the writer, it's almost like a cancel culture. You're probably too young to remember, but there was a character called Bobby in Dallas. Same goes for who gets killed, and of course they had to bring him back too. And the one I use is there was The Archers, which is a long-running English radio series. At a certain point, in order to compete with ITV, which had just started, they killed off Grace Archer in an episode of The Archers, and so it's a great PR event to kill off your main character. Of course. The thing about Conan Doyle was a great PR event, and everyone knew about it. And the Prince of Wales wore a black armband of mourning, but because it didn't do Conan Doyle any good, because he couldn't write any more stories. So it was a sort of counterproductive PR gesture. But the other thing that you made me remember is that, of course, one of the appeals of Sherlock Holmes was that, the thing about the Strand was a mass-produced magazine that people bought, from the newsagents when they commuted to work. And so many of the Conan Doyle stories, so many of the Sherlock Holmes stories take place in the suburbs of London. And so he was the great, this was, the importance of popular culture. There was, you would buy your copy of the Strand and you would read it when you commuted to work. And there would be
next to the Sherlock Holmes story would be a essay about the ears of prominent people, and you would have whole pages of people's ears, which, the principle, that how you could tell people's characters from the ears, or, all sorts of things. Or, my character Rafiu Diname wrote in the Strand magazine about, like Hello magazine, about him, teaching the Queen Hindustani, so it was a great thing of popular culture. And I remember when I was in the middle of writing this, I was still corresponding for the Times, and one of the editors came out and we were having dinner, and I was telling him about the book, and he had spent a lot of time in Japan. And he said, of course, Sherlock Holmes is incredibly popular in Japan, and I think it's like the second or third most read children's book. It's by young teenagers as they read Sherlock Holmes. And he said the idea is that it's sort of the epitome of English respectability. It's the epitome of Englishness, and so the fact that Conan Doyle is this unconventional character who snubs his nose at the establishment, but of course he's very much a part of that establishment, and he supports that establishment through unconventional ways. So there is a sort of, apart from the fact that the story, the character is good, there is this cultural resonance as well, I think.
Yeah. How do you think Doyle would react to the modern interpretations of his creation?
Well, apparently he didn't mind the parodies. He sort of encouraged them. I mean, of course, a lot of them are crap, and everyone minds them. But I have to say that the gold standard of parodies, if you can ever find it, is a story by Anthony Burgess called something of Time. I can't remember the exact title, but I put it in the book. But it's not a stylistic parody. It doesn't try and imitate the language, but it's just this brilliant, clever story to reach along so quickly, and has this very ingenious mystery and solution. And if they could all be that good, then I'm sure he wouldn't mind.
Yeah. So Andy, I have a special area of interest, and I know that you are also into gastronomy.
Yes.
I have about 30 or 40 articles where I dwell on the gastronomical preferences of fictional detectives and how that relates to their culture, how that reflects their tastes, etc. And I see that here you have lots of references to
It's inevitable.
what Holmes eats and drinks. I have two questions here.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about this. This is mostly out of curiosity. Whiskey peg was what my generation affectionately called their whiskey sodas. What does whiskey peg mean, and why did your generation call it whiskey peg?
Well, it wasn't. It was a whiskey peg is an Anglo-Indian thing, which I must have come across somewhere. I think it must exist in what they call the canon, and it's just whiskey and soda, but it's an Anglo-Indian.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Holmes also likes his whiskey with soda. Yeah. He has a gasogene machine, right, for producing gas. Yeah. The wine he drinks, Burn or Tokay or Montrachet. Also, you have new gastronomical elements in the story, like for, what was that?
What? But my main character only likes to drink Burgundy, and of course. Because when he's taken out to dinner by Layla, by his counterpart, she insists on ordering New Zealand, he can't stand it.
Non-English, yeah. So we have risotto for the vegetarians.
Yeah.
In the novel, we have Sherlock Holmes also loves game meat. We have partridge and stuff. How do you approach incorporating food and drink to the narrative and on the importance of that?
Well, how do you not? I mean, I didn't sort of.
Exactly.
Well, I'm greedy and I write about food, and it's good. It's important. Food plays a part. There's a scene which I like, which is where Rafiu Diname character finds himself in a sort of village near Ayub, and he's sort of hijacked by a court official, and they sit down to this impromptu meal, and some man with a izgara and a whatever, and he brings out all these foods, and they have this sort of impromptu ruckus at front, and for the first time this Indian gets blind drunk, and he's sort of overwhelmed by this, this sort of Turkish ritual and this sort of bonhomie of an evening out, and it completely transforms his life too.
Yeah.
So it's, food is important.
Very important. In narratives too.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about your future works? Can we expect another work of fiction?
Not if my family has anything to do with it. Yes, but I have an idea for another book, one fiction, one nonfiction. The nonfiction I can talk about because it's about food.
Okay.
And it's a sort of history of Turkey as told through meals that I've had. As I say, there's no point writing a history of Turkey because the moment you set something down on paper, it's like painting, the Brooklyn Bridge or the Humber Bridge. You have to, the moment you finish, you have to start all over again because everything changes so quickly. So the idea is to sort of try and capture particular moments of in Turkish history through
food, right?
Through meals.
That's
through meals. And it's true. The first meal I ever had in Istanbul the winter of January 1967. I remember exactly what I had.
What was it?
Which was it was the first time I ever tasted sturgeon, mersinbal, and smoked sturgeon, and the national football team was at another table. This was in the Tarabya Hotel, as was. And they brought out this ice sculpture of a football, and I don't know. I remember this. Yeah.
So would you like to add anything else?
Well, talking about food.
Yeah.
There's drinks and some canapes next door, so we shouldn't talk too long. But if there's anyone starting to ask a question,
if you have questions.
I'm not sure anyone's read the book, so there probably won't be many questions.
I'd love to ask you a question.
Of course.
How did you, as a Sherlockian, find it?
Oh, it's very clever. It's really clever, very intriguing. Two iconic characters is really hard to incorporate, and together with two new characters, that's really hard. And also, along with the narrative of this book, there's a Sherlock Holmes pastiche in this book also. You have almost three stories, told by so many perspectives, so many characters. Brilliant, I loved it.
Good.
Andrew.
Yes.
Sure.
I'm curious about, the relationship you have with Abdülhamid and how you got to know him better. Was there a research process or in line, connected like this or a follow-up? There is, he is a contentious figure, but there is more interest in him, it seems, of late. I think Zülfü recently wrote a book. A story
about his doctor, about his doctorate, yeah.
And what do you think of that? And why is there this really renewed popular culture?
Well, I mean, there's been a whole, revision. I mean, he was loathed by the generations after him, and then of course now you have this 160-part series called Payitaht, in which he's, the Messiah.
Yeah.
And which, with this sort of
Did you watch that?
No, I never have. But he's anti-Semitic and he's nationalist and but he's a great hero. So there are these two very different views of him. And so at a certain point I decided, and then, I mean, again, I'm happily sort of live in a family where there's a historian and who has friends who are other historians, and some of them are 19th century historians. And I mean, one of the things that I latched onto was that he was very self-conscious about his image. And this Selim Deringil, who's a 19th century historian, writes about how he would be very, one of the functions of the ambassador, the Ottoman ambassador to the courts of St. James was this guy Rustem Pasha, who was in fact Italian, and one of his functions was to go around to theaters and make sure that Turks were depicted in a positive light, and that you didn't have this sort of harem girls and harem scarum sort of shenanigans, and so one of the things in my book is this we didn't talk about it, but in 1893, when Sherlock Holmes dies, the Olympia, which is the great exhibition hall in West London, is turned into a replica of Constantinople, and based on the success of it having been Venice the previous year, and this great theatrical impresario called Olossi Kiralfi, who was a Hungarian, but from a Hungarian Jewish family, and they were great dancers and worked with Barnum and Bailey and all these people. They produced this huge. They turned basically you would go to Addison Road, which is station, which is now Olympia Station, and you would rent a kayak, which would take you down a canal into Olympia, because the previous year it had been the Grand Canal. You could take a gondola, and then you would go through the pillars, the cisterns, and 1,001 nights and this and that. And every day there would be 2 musical spectacles with 2,000 performers in the spectacle in the play, and so you had this complete reproduction of Constantinople in West London in 1893, and I don't know if it's a coincidence or not, but all the founders of modern Pakistan lived in that neighborhood. And I was just reading the memoirs of someone called Halil Alit, who was he was one of the first lecturers in Turkish in Cambridge, and was a refugee, and he was a dissident who fled Abdülhamid, and then his loyalty was bought by the embassy, and he went back to Istanbul, then went away again. And he's this sort of curious character. He escapes from Istanbul because he didn't have a passport. He got on some freighter which took him to Hull, and then from Hull he took a train to London, and the only place he knew to go to was Kensington, because that's where the Olympia was, and he figured he'd find some Turks there, because he ends up in Kensington. He ends up in Kensington, and he's so disappointed because Abdülhamid wouldn't allow real Turks to leave the country for this. Turkish boatmen couldn't leave the country and get passports, so they were all Jewish Turks. They were whatever.
Why wouldn't he?
Because you had to in order to leave the country, you had to have a passport.
You didn't get passports.
You couldn't play football under the reign of Abdülhamid. There were, if you were Muslim, you couldn't play football until
later on. Wow.
So, I guess the people right by talk don't know that they shouldn't play football. I guess that would change things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, there you go.
Can I still ask questions?
Yeah. as long as they're easy ones. Yeah.
What's your favorite Sherlock Holmes story?
Oh no, there's a question. I guess this. I suppose the first one is what is the
Scandal in Bohemia.
The Scandal in Bohemia is. That's what the characters in the book like.
The go-to story, right?
Because it's got everything. It's Sherlock Holmes is fully formed. It's got a mystery. It's
Irene Adler.
Everything is there. And Sherlock Holmes is a fragile. He has a personality, and he's not. He's fooled by a woman. And so. But of course, the Speckled Band was also great, and the first one, which is the Zira, which didn't appear in the Strand, which appeared, the very first appearance of Sherlock Holmes is in this novella.
Sign of the Fall?
Yes, is it Sign of the Fall?
Yeah.
Which takes with the Mormons and and where he befriends Watson, and he sort of he does all the parlor tricks of knowing that Watson fought in the campaign.
It was discarded. I just couldn't remember.
I can't remember either. But the story itself is sort of silly because it goes off on this tangent.
Historian Scarlet.
Studying Scarlet.
Studying Scarlet.
That's right. Which didn't appear in the Strand. Appeared somewhere else. But there, of course, the characters are there.
Yes, and that's also very important.
And they never change. Yeah. That's them. But I guess, and of course, the Red-Headed League isn't bad. The Red-Headed League is actually, I don't know if you know the story. It's someone puts an ad for someone a job for people who have pure red hair, and the job is copying the Encyclopedia Britannica. So every day he goes off and he copies the Encyclopedia Britannica. Meanwhile, the villains are in the basement of his shop, tunneling into a bank, and and Sherlock Holmes figures this out. But there was a real there was a real sort of crime modeled on that, where the Lloyd's Bank, all the safe deposit boxes in a Lloyd's Bank were robbed the same way. And in fact, there were these compromising photos of Princess Margaret, which were taken at the time. And so it's quite it was like imitating Arthur and then some.
I guess they left a note for Holmes to solve it, right?
Yes, they spray painted on the wall, let Sherlock solve this.
Okay.
So, but then the later ones get a bit tedious.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all.